And we're live now.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Senate Government Operations Committee on Tuesday, January 9th. And we are starting with some testimony on Prop 1 or Proposal 1, which is a constitutional amendment related to county officers. And we started working on this and did quite a bit of work last session, and we heard from our current witness, and we're going to hear from him again, Judge Sone, just to see if you've had any additional or contrary thoughts since you testified with us last year. So if you want to just introduce yourself.
Well, thank you. Tom Sone, Chief Superior Judge. I've had a chance to review the new draft. As I think I probably said last year, and I'll say it again, this is a policy decision for the committee, the legislature, and the citizens of Vermont, because as this committee has discussed, even if the legislature passes it, it goes to the voters to make that final decision. And so I won't weigh in on the policy impacts, but I would note the impacts on the judiciary, because if this does pass, there would be impacts. I believe that during committee discussions, you've highlighted the fact that what this bill does is it brings in line each of the county officers. Obviously, taking away the high bailiff issue, but the other county officers, you bring in with qualifications and removal. And so it has one standard essentially for the county officers. In connection with that, we currently have, as we talked about last year, the qualifications is part of the Constitution for probate judges. And the impacts of this bill on the judiciary would be ones that I listened to your testimony and hearing from last Friday. So these are things that you discussed. And when you talked about there's a difference between suspension and removal, you're correct. This bill would allow the future legislature to make determinations on what would be appropriate for the qualifications and potential removal. Currently, the mechanism for removal for probate judges as well as assistant judges is impeachment. And the question would be, what does removal look like? And that would be one for the legislature hearing testimony to make decisions on in the future. And I think, Chair Hardy, you commented last week about and I think Senator Clarkson too, the idea would be that potentially one of the ways it could be is, well, if the Supreme Court says you're suspended permanently, maybe that's a removal. Well, certainly those are the types of things that a future legislature would have to address. But the impact of this right away would be that it would provide the legislature with I'll use the word flexibility to respond. And it was, when you look at a constitutional provision that's put in hundreds of years ago, it sometimes doesn't always fit well in our modern world. And so the way you're doing it provides a framework for future legislatures to address the qualifications as well as the removal statutes. And the removal statutes and the removal statutes especially address what I think has been identified as that gap in the Ray Hill case between suspension and removal. Exactly. So, and I would certainly be willing to and anxious to answer any questions you might have about impacts and how it would affect us.
Okay. Are there any questions? Senator White?
If someone were to be unable to, they're removed from office, I want to make sure I get the right terminology, but they're not removed from office, but they're not able to do the job, like they're not allowed. They still get paid. Do they still get benefits, and do they still get information about like either the cases in the case of an assistant judge or then a state's attorneys? Like, do they still have full access to all of that information?
When I'll use an assistant judge, for instance, for example, when an assistant judge has been removed from office, he or she is removed from their judicial duties. When that happens, if it is a state courthouse, access is cut off to the state courthouse.
Okay.
They do not have access to the state network, whether it's email, Odyssey, whatever it may be. The assistant judges are paid by the counties for their judicial functions in court. So we don't control that. We control whether or not the judiciary controls whether or not they would receive payment for doing other actions, uncontested divorces, traffic work, things like that. But they would not be able to do that either. As far as their county jobs, no, it wouldn't impact that. So they would still, and that's that distinction, is that even though the judiciary can say you're no longer a judge, they still are not impacted with their county job. And that is something that I would note as a practical matter can create an interesting circumstance. If you're an assistant judge, you're in charge of the county building. And so let's say that the judiciary says, well, you are no longer allowed to serve. You're convicted of a crime and you are no longer a judicial officer. It's still your building and you're still allowed to come in, whether it's after hours or whatever, but it would still be your ability to go in there. And so that certainly creates a circumstance that's difficult. We also had, and I know the committee has talked about it, a situation with a probate judge who was suspended for a period of time. And there was, until a certain point got reached, that was a suspension with pay.
Okay. Well, thank you.
And even if the judiciary revokes all of their duties, you can't actually remove them from office. They're still technically an assistant judge or a probate judge. They're just not in practice an assistant judge or a probate judge.
That's correct. They may not have any, they will not be serving any judicial function. They will be, if the Supreme Court suspends them permanently, but the office is not deemed vacant for purposes of replacement.
Right, and I think that's a key point, is that we couldn't then have a new judge appointed or until this person either resigns or is out because of an election.
That's correct.
Yeah, or is impeached. Yeah. Senator Dikowski.
So does that functionally mean that there's nobody doing those duties because this office is held by someone who can't do those duties?
In the assistant judge, that would generally be the case. We don't generally assign someone else to come over and serve as an assistant judge. There is a provision that could allow it, but that's not something we see. So if you have two assistant judges in your county, and one of them is removed from judicial duties based upon disciplinary action, you then have one assistant judge to sit in the cases. If, for instance, you have one assistant judge who is removed, and then you have another assistant judge who has a significant illness, then effectively you've got none.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference is, if you have a probate judge, we covered that. In other words, what we did was, when Judge Cobb, that was who was when he was suspended, at that point, we then brought in probate judges from other counties to make sure the work got done. Mm-hmm. So we are able to fill that, but the unique role of the assistant judge in court is not something that is filled.
As a follow-up to that, and maybe it doesn't have any bearing at all, but I know that our judges are being pulled in a lot of different directions. Is it possible that it could happen where you couldn't pull a probate judge from another county because they have their own busy county and weren't able to help out in another county?
We only have one probate judge in the state who is full-time, and I'll use air quotes on that. When there was the restructure, we went from having a number of more than 14, we went down to one per county. And so many of the probate judges are not deemed full-time. So there historically has been the ability, the bandwidth, if you will, to have someone fill in and help. So I would not anticipate that would be an issue.
Okay, thanks.
Well,
And we have retired judges who have often stepped in to help us with our shortages with judges all over the state. So I don't see that being a problem.
I don't anticipate that would be an issue, filling the probate judge slots to get assistance for an interim period.
but the point is that there's somebody who is supposed to be doing the job, who can't do the job, and you have to find a replacement, but we can't have a newly elected replacement or appointed replacement because somebody is technically holding that position.
That's right.
Yeah. Senator Watson.
Thanks. I just want to make sure I'm really clear about the payment. So it sounds like there are some services that normally they would do that they would get paid for. If they're not doing the job, they don't get that pay. Separate from that, is there still payment inherent to the office that they still receive even though they're not doing it?
For probate or assistant judges?
Either.
Well, they're different.
They're different.
Okay.
In many counties, the assistant judges, I believe, get a stipend.
Okay.
Plus, I believe they get hourly pay for certain other work.
Mm-hmm.
So they still may be getting paid, even if they're not judges and getting judge pay, they would still have the ability for compensation there. In terms of probate judges, a probate judge gets a salary and they are entitled to benefits and retirement under Vermont law. And if that probate judge is, let's say, in a county that they're 3/5, that means they're essentially getting paid 3/5 of what the judge from Chittenden is getting paid, which sets the full-time judge. So that would mean theoretically that judge should have 2 extra days a week to possibly assist, but it's a part-time position. And so saying to that judge, well, you're now going to assist in county X because that judge is suspended and you're not going to get paid for it. Well, that something doesn't work there. And so what we would do is we say, okay, you will be compensated at the probate judge hourly rate for the time you spend in this other county.
But for let's say the probate judge is the one suspended, or are they still able to get a salary?
They receive their salary until such time as there's the permanent suspension where it would be deemed without pay.
No, removal would be a permanent
Well,
suspension.
removal would be, well, there's difference between permanent suspension and removal. The Supreme Court can say you can no longer serve as a probate judge. The legislature can remove you as a probate judge.
Right, and I think there's a difference between these positions. So for example, with the sheriff position, because the sheriff doesn't have a judiciary overseeing them and sending them the check. There are sheriffs, there's a current sheriff that's still getting paid to be the sheriff, even though he is no longer a certified law enforcement officer and is no longer able to do the functions of his position, but he's still receiving pay because he doesn't have the judiciary sort of oversight that a judge would. Yeah, exactly. I figured that's what it was.
Yes.
So, and state's attorneys are similar to the judiciary in that they have this sort of oversight structure. The sheriff is the one that doesn't really as much.
Okay.
Senator Clarkson, did you have another? I saw your hand up.
No.
Senator Bielanski.
My question, I don't believe is for Judge Zone, it's sort of a broader, but my understanding currently, it's because you brought up state's attorneys, is a state's attorney could be elected that is not an attorney, correct?
That's what we're hoping will be a requirement, at least.
No, I understand,
Yes.
but presently,
Yes.
that could happen, and then what would happen? Would they just not be able to serve in the office?
I think they would not be able to do many of the duties that are required of the position, like supervising other attorneys. So they would functionally not be able to do the position, but they could be hired to run the office and hire people, and then I would presume they would have to, and you correct me if I'm saying anything wrong, I don't know, but they would have to hire somebody who would be the attorney that oversees the other attorneys.
Like a managing partner.
Yeah, something like that. It would be not a good situation, but it's possible, I think, to be elected state's attorney without being an attorney. But let me, since we don't have Tim here, I'm gonna just.
At the moment, that is the case,
That is what I thought, and I was just,
but it means they can't function in court.
Right.
They can manage, and if they're a great manager, maybe but it means you're paying for somebody who's also not able to work in court, which is really like.
Right, the only one that has qualifications in the Constitution is probate judge, so
Okay.
it does not apply to state's attorneys. I just wanted to know while Judge Zoney is here, we did invite the chair of the Judicial Conduct Board and the vice chair of the Judicial Conduct Board and the executive director of the Bar Association, and they all declined to testify, saying they would defer to Judge Zoney. So I just wanted you all to know that they were, and anybody who is listening, who cares, they were invited and deferred to you because they didn't want to get crosswise with you, I guess. But also, they didn't have anything that they would say that would be different than what you would say. So I just wanted, we are trying to cover all of our bases, and if there are anybody else you can think of we should invite in that we maybe haven't yet.
I saw you had assistant judges, you had Department of State's attorneys, you had the sheriffs on. I think you're getting good players to discuss things.
Yeah, and we had some constitutional scholars and a former Supreme Court justice last session, so we've had quite a few people. Okay, are there any other questions for Judge Zoney? Senator Norris?
I'm not sure if Judge Zoney is the expert I should be asking this particular question or two. I guess my question is whether or not you support Prop 1 or you don't is in our county, and I can use that as an example, the sheriff has been stripped of his law enforcement authorities forever, it appears. Now, it's my understanding that under statutes, benefits and pay are set by Vermont statutes, not as a constitutionally elected position. So is there a mechanism where if the criminal justice council says you can't be a police officer no more or ever, and we pass a law that says, and we're not paying you salary and or benefits no more? I realize that still will not prevent that individual from wanting to stay in the office if he or she chooses to run that route. But where would the incentive be, I guess, is what I'm wondering. But do we have the authority to say, we're not paying you no more?
I don't believe it would be appropriate for me to weigh in on something like that, because that could be a pending legal issue. If the legislature enacted a statute and somebody didn't agree with that statute, there could be a dispute. I don't think it's appropriate for me to opine on that.
I appreciate that. We institute a lot of statutes, don't we?
Well, we did ask that question last year, Senator Norris, in the context of S-17, the bill about sheriffs, saying, could we create a statute that says if you get your law enforcement certification removed, you would no longer get paid? And our legislative council attorney advised that would likely be deemed unconstitutional. So that was the advice that we can ask Tim that directly this year. Again, for the record, if you're, next time he's in here on this bill, let's remember to ask him. And that was one of the reasons why, there aren't clear mechanisms right now for all four of the offices about removal or, and in some cases even sort of review of conduct. So this would help clarify all of that.
So if I could just follow up with the state's attorney then, if they've been disbarred by the bar, do they still receive pay?
I don't know what the rules are for the Department of State's attorneys.
That's in statute too, the state's attorney, each county's state's attorney's pay is in the Pay Act, so I'm assuming it's probably a similar deal where we would still have to pay them.
Yeah, and I think one of the big differences is the sheriff runs their own department and their own, books, whereas a probate judge doesn't, and a county judge does for part of the job, but not all of it. So.
Does probate judge not run them? They run their own office. I mean,
they're a division of the Superior Court.
Department.
A probate division, it's a division of the Superior Court. It did change when we had the unification of the courts.
Right.
And so it used to be much more of a independent, if you will, and hiring and things like that. Now they are a division of the Superior Court.
But the state's attorney's office is pretty much unto the state's attorney. They do their own hiring in conjunction with the State's Attorneys Association.
That's
They do a
my,
lot of the administration in conjunction, but they are pretty much their own unit, that's my understanding.
that was my understanding, but certainly John Campbell would be able to let you know more about that.
All right, are there any other questions for Judge Sone? And so what I'm hearing, just you have no opposition to the constitutional amendment. You're not gonna weigh in favor, but you're not opposed. Is that?
Correct. I am not taking a position that yes, you should vote it through, or no, you should not. I'm just saying, if you vote this through as a policy decision, here are the potential impacts as we perceive the bill and how they could come out.
And how they might help clarify.
Yes, clarification would certainly seem that many of the discussions you're having around the table as to what can we do or can't we do would be clarified.
We've had
Exactly.
fewer discussions.
There would be less gray area.
And I will say, and I think Senator Norris hears me, and Senator Vasky hears me say this in judiciary quite a bit. I like the clarity. The more we can add clarity is good.
Like clarity.
I like
Clarity is easier for the judiciary.
It's easier for the judiciary, it's
And
easier
for all
for
of
the
us.
public.
All right, well, thank you very much, Judge Sone.
Thank you.
It's nice to see you.
Good to see everyone. Have a great day.
For the cookies.
Well, I will tell Carrie. I will let her know. Thank you.
We'll see you tomorrow morning.
And,
See you in the morning.
Inside, right?
I mean, we never share our Kateri cookies